Welcome to the Shaping Portsmouth podcast. Shaping Portsmouth is a collaboration of key Portsmouth businesses, transforming Portsmouth together. Hello and welcome to another Shaping Portsmouth podcast with me, CEO Dave Humphries, and today I am joined by Felicity Harris, who is Portsmouth City Council's strategic lead for climate resilience and natural environment. Welcome, Felicity.
Thank you, Dave. It's lovely to be here, and it's a gorgeous day today. Talking about the natural environment, I walked here from the Civic, and it was so wonderful to see so many of the sort of green, new trees that have been planted and many of the green spaces on offer in Portsmouth.
Definitely, it is lovely out there today, and Portsmouth is a lovely, lovely place when the weather's good. What exactly, because that's quite a title, strategic lead for climate resilience and natural environment. What is it your job actually about at Portsmouth City Council, Felicity?
Thank you, Dave. It's quite a new role. So over the last few years, the council has been looking at how it becomes a green and healthy city. That's part of the Imagine 2040 vision. And there was quite a big focus on natural infrastructure, planting trees across the city to help with things like reducing stormwater problems on our roads and in other spaces, cooling the city, and also planting trees to reduce the impacts of noise, pollution, and improve air quality. Like other places in the UK, we're starting to look more at how we become a well-adapted city. So we know that climate change is happening. There's more and more evidence about the way in which towns and cities such as ours will be affected by the climate change. So I feel that a lot of the role now is kind of looking ahead and getting us ready so that we are adapted to those changes, and as a community of businesses, individuals, residents, and a local authority are able to bounce back from any of those challenges that may be posed by, for example, heat waves or flooding.
Yeah. So you mentioned sort of the 2040 vision in there, which is obviously, that aspirational piece around what we want the city to look like in 2040 and what we would hope is going on. A lot of the focus we hear about is this sort of decarbonisation and being carbon neutral by 2030. But I suppose it's rather than going into a whole chat about decarbonisation, which is not your role, I think it's the impact of what that's having on the environment that's quite important, and the effect that has on our city. So first and foremost, Portsmouth's in a climate emergency, isn't it? So what does that mean?
It is. The council declared a climate emergency, I think, back in 2019, and that means we've recognised that climate change is happening. It's here. We're committing to decarbonisation activity. And, for example, you'll be aware of the installation of solar panels across many spaces in Portsmouth, things like shore power at the port, and also some of the adaptation activity that the council started to initiate, for example, the sea wall. So climate emergency is kind of that idea. It's a call to action, really, for not just the local authority, but partners across the local authority, whether those are individuals, businesses, or the voluntary sector, to move forward and respond to mitigating the climate change by decarbonisation, but also increasingly recognising that we will be living in an increasingly warming world and adapting to those challenges so the city can continue to thrive.
Yep. So, I mean, that warming environment is probably the most noticeable consequence, and then that has other impacts in itself as well. But I suppose first and foremost, that has links particularly to people that could be more vulnerable around heat increases to well-being, doesn't it? Then therefore has an impact on our whole community.
It really does. It really does, Dave. And in 2024, at the back end of 2024, PCC's Public Health Directorate released an annual report which focused on climate change. We've done some work. We've been out to schools. Last year, we conducted a questionnaire. We wanted to understand what it was like for the school community at the moment, when, for example, we have heat waves. And all of our respondents, a third of Portsmouth schools responded, and all talked about the challenges, increasing challenges of heat, both in the classroom and in the playground. So children and young people are one of those sort of more vulnerable population groups. Older people, people over 65, again, are more vulnerable to increased heat. Those, for example, with a pre-existing health condition.
Yep.
And, you know, across Portsmouth, you'll be aware there are some parts of the city that are naturally cooler because of a coastal breeze or because there's parks and green spaces. And there are some parts of the city that are naturally hotter because there isn't those green spaces. There's a lot of like concrete, which kind of reflects or traps and reflects that heat. So depending on who you are and where you are and your access to opportunities to sort of keep cool, your vulnerability, for example, to things like increased heat will change.
So how, in terms of tackling that as a problem, how important are green spaces?
Hugely important. Green spaces don't kind of absorb the heat, so they'll kind of get rid of the heat. Vegetation transpires and that cools things. Trees are particularly good at cooling. And I don't know whether you've ever been walking through, I'm sure you have, walked along a street in Portsmouth sort of in June or July, and that relief when you sort of like get under a tree, it's quite cool. I remember last year actually walking through the Cascades and seeing sort of people congregating, sort of sitting under some of those lovely trees. And I think that kind of shows we naturally gravitate to those green spaces or cooler places when it's hot. But of course, in Portsmouth, one of our challenges is that we are a very dense and compact city. So we can't just make lots of new green space. So it's about doing the best with what we've got, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and recently I recorded a podcast with Keith from Southern Water who talked about the exact same thing, the impact of the amount of concrete in relation to the stormwater overflow issue. And again, one of the solutions to that was increasing the amount of greenery and particularly trees in the city to help deal with that water overflow. So it has a big impact on our environment and making it better all round.
It really does. And one thing people sort of talk about green infrastructure, so green spaces, rain gardens. You may see sort of rain gardens popping up around the city along the some of the highways.
That was certainly what Keith was talking about.
Yeah,
definitely.
and trees and. The green infrastructure gives multiple benefits. So obviously, Keith was talking to you about stormwater regulation, reducing surface runoff. We've talked about cooling in this podcast, but there's so much evidence to suggest that even having a view of green space or of a tree improves your mental health. And in fact, actually sort of green spaces, the presence of green spaces in neighbourhoods has been shown to have so many other beneficial effects, as well as kind of mental health and reduced stress. The fact that where there are green spaces, when green spaces are present, people tend to go, so they tend to be more physically active. But they're also great places to sort of knit communities together and for for a sort of a wider sense of community well-being. So really green infrastructure does have multiple benefits.
It's you see it a lot, don't you? When like you look at a nice architect's drawing, there's invariably a couple of trees either side because it just makes it look better and feel nicer.
It does. It softens it, and I think we're moving into a space now where we're increasingly recognising green infrastructure or green as essential. Not that just that kind of it looks pretty, but it's essential to the functioning of places, particularly as our climate changes. Essential tool in helping us be well adapted.
So, in terms of your role within the council and driving that, I quite like that phrase, the green infrastructure, and driving that green infrastructure forward. What are you doing? What sort of projects? What work do you do day to day to try and help move that forward? What's your role involve?
So that's a good question. We've had a lot of focus on trees, and we've just done some work, and really, really grateful to have volunteers across Portsmouth going out and surveying trees for us, understanding what the trees we have in the city, what types of trees there are, what age the trees are, how many trees we've got, and their condition and health. And we've used all that evidence to develop an urban forest master plan. So we're not the only people, we're not the only sort of things affected by our climate changing. As our climate changes, increasingly, for example, some of the natural infrastructure or green infrastructure in our city may be stressed. So we know that we need trees that are resistant to some of the pests and diseases we might see coming across or coming in, sort of spreading more across the city. We know that we need our trees to be more tolerant of drought conditions, because projections would show that we're going to have a decrease in rainfall in summer months in the city. So we've sort of been working on an urban forest master plan to develop resilience in our treescape, so not only increase our treescape, but to develop that resilience so we can withstand those future threats. So that's something we've been working on. We're really having quite a big focus with the tree planting and natural infrastructure in neighbourhoods that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So that's seen us doing greening and depaving projects in those neighbourhoods and getting some more of that green infrastructure in. As I talked earlier, we're aware of the impacts of changing climate in schools, not just heating. A lot of schools report problems with surface water flooding, children not being able to use playing fields. So, of course, that reflects health and well-being, not so physically active. So we've got a number of projects with schools across the city to enhance school grounds so the green infrastructure performs more, delivers more cooling, more stormwater regulation. And we're sort of starting to take that approach with some settings, health and social care settings. But I think a big part of the role going forward, I don't think the city council can't do it alone. This is responding to the climate emergency is something that requires collaboration. So I feel that exploring how we all work together across the city to become well adapted is going to be very important.
Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second, a bit more. But something you mentioned in there actually was the decrease in rainfall in the summer months, and that was being predicted. So is that something that's linked to climate change overall, the decrease in rainfall, or is that just like weather patterns? Or
no, it is linked to climate change. Last year, the Met Office published a climate change toolkit. It was designed for local authorities, and essentially anyone can go on a website and you can download a report for your local authority area. Actually, I brought some of the figures along with me, Dave. So the Met Office predicts that sort of by the end of the 2030s, our summer rainfall rates per day will have reduced by about 10%, but winter we will see more rain, probably up by about 12%. So we just get that change pattern, and as you can imagine, that will cause stresses for vegetation. And if those stresses, if vegetation's stressed, it may be more susceptible to diseases, more susceptible to like direct heat problems, and we could therefore lose some of that vegetation. So kind of understanding what and how we can work with our natural infrastructure so that it is resilient, because we want those benefits. That's very important.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it, when you look at when you consider everything, sort of the whole ecosystem, and how one little change then impacts. Because obviously we hear a lot about, the summer droughts are invariably nothing to do with lack of rain in the summer, but generally to do with lack of rain in the winter. That's not sort of restocking the chalk downs and stuff like that we get our water from in the natural springs. So in that sense, a bit of added rainfall in the winter's good, I suppose, but it does then make that time of year even more bleak, and adds to that well-being effect on people, because now not only is it cold, dark, it's also wet. But then, of course, in summer, all of that greenery that we love and we want to get out and enjoy has now not got the much-needed rain that time of year. So
absolutely,
it has a knock-on.
It does, and to keep green. And I think one of the sort of challenges is that if summer vegetation browns off, even sort of the grassy areas brown off, they're no longer able to give you those cooling benefits, and then areas become hard and dusty. And when it does rain, those areas can't absorb the rainfall as well. So I think we're all having to adapt to a changed world, and I think the more we work with each other, have conversations, and are observant, that's going to really help sort of generate that knowledge. I would sort of say, it's not something we have experienced before, so we kind of it's a learning process for everybody.
Definitely. So going back to where we left off then, is not a problem that is just the councils to solve. We need everyone involved in the solution to this. So what can people do?
Individually, obviously different people live in different settings, have different kind of tools available to them. I think for your own personal resilience, there are things you can do. For example, consider how you can keep your house cool in summer months. You may want to plant a tree in your front garden. You may be in a situation where you come home from work and it's absolutely baking in your house or flat. And it's sort of things we don't think about. But closing the curtains during the daytime to keep the heat out. There is actually a really good website from Adaptation Scotland, which kind of gives individuals some ideas of things they can do. And of course, you talked about talking to Southern Water. If you can install a water butt, that's an absolutely great thing to do. Reduces that kind of surface water or storm water going into the system. Businesses, I think it's really useful to understand who, if you're a business, who in your workforce may be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. People who work outdoors, people who work in the top parts of buildings are going to feel the effects more.
And that's an important issue that we've not actually touched on yet from the business perspective, particularly with the Procurement Act 2023 putting an emphasis on well-being and social value, but quite a big emphasis on well-being. This is a well-being issue for people at work. You know, in the summer months in a hot office or a hot factory or a whatever work, or especially if you're working outside, I suppose, as well. There's a responsibility for employers to safeguard their employees there. For the business community, this is quite a big issue, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I definitely think it is. And I think there is something about creating some time to work through some of those questions. Who do I employ? Where are they? How vulnerable do I think my workforce is to climate change? What can or to some of the impacts of climate change, whether it's heat or perhaps people can't get into the office. I've had days where I can't get into the office. I use the train because there's there's storms. So I think going through a checklist and asking yourself those questions is important. And again, I will give you the link, but Adaptation Scott have a really good resource to support SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises and other businesses think about the impact of climate change on their workforce.
Yeah. And I suppose for bigger businesses, it wouldn't be unusual to find somebody within the organisation dedicated to that sustainability piece, looking at their own carbon footprint, because sustainability is one of those things that people place a lot of value on when they're commissioning services, buying goods, etc. So that's, there's a business benefit to doing that, but it does have a knock-on effect as well to your own staff, your own work environment. SMEs probably not so likely to have someone dedicated to that. So resources like that really, really useful to help businesses get their head around what they can do and how they can contribute to solving the problem.
Absolutely. And I think sort of bringing the business community together to kind of talk through some of those issues is really important as well, because I think in this space it requires a lot of every business is individual, every sort of work setting will have its own ideas and capabilities. And I think the more we can kind of share that knowledge and share ideas, it stops people having to start from scratch, and it makes the task easier. And in fact, you've been talking about some of the impacts on business. There is some evidence to suggest that employee absenteeism increases in heat waves,
Right.
and that productivity falls in heat waves. So absolutely, if you want your business to thrive, get climate adapted.
Yeah, to be fair, you probably don't need to be a rocket scientist to work that one out either. It makes a lot of sense, but it just might be something you've not thought about prior to that. But yeah, it's an obvious one, isn't it? That if the working environment's more comfortable, people are going to perform better.
Absolutely, and feel cared for. And I think going back to your point, Dave, I think consumers or people who are procuring services and products are increasingly really wanting to see that idea, this is a business who is committed to the sustainability agenda.
Yeah. I think that the amount of stuff we've seen on the news with sort of environmental action groups and the impact that they have, and it's sometimes it's a really conflicted debate where people believe in the cause and really want to support that because they want the environment to be better, don't necessarily support how those groups are going about it. But I think the I don't know, do we call it the green pound? It has a lot of power, doesn't it? It's, people do want to buy responsibly and look for businesses that are being environmentally responsible and support those. Sometimes it's, people will pay a bit extra to have the reassurance that the impact on the environment is going to be less.
Absolutely. People are looking for for those credentials, and often younger audiences in particular, and obviously Portsmouth's got a big student community. I think there's, I think you just sort of alluded to the fact that navigating some of the inevitable tensions or perceived tensions between the green agenda, for example, and the economy, and sort of what people can see as sort of that economic progression versus a green movement. Potentially people perceive it as like stopping economic progression. I think the more kind of dialogue we can have and realise that these issues aren't sort of black and white or one versus the other, but that we can navigate those spaces, as you use the word sustainable, sustainably.
Yeah. So if you could kind of describe to me what a well-adapted Portsmouth looks like, what would we be talking about? What are the changes we need to see to make Portsmouth more adapted?
So what does a well-adapted Portsmouth look like? I think what we're talking about is a Portsmouth where people and businesses can thrive.
Yeah.
And in the face of a changing climate. So we are able to withstand, for example, heat waves, flooding events, storms. We have an infrastructure that's not going to be knocked out by storms.
Yep.
We have people who can go to workplaces and thrive in those workplaces on hot days. That to me is a well-adapted Portsmouth. Our ability to, as individuals, the community and businesses, sort of continue to thrive.
So it's having the capacity to deal with all of those events as a city, as a community, as individuals, and so that they have less impact on us.
Absolutely, it's about reducing our vulnerabilities to those impacts. Yeah, and I think that requires some, forward conversations, some horizon scanning. I know that over the last couple of years, there's been sort of national debate or criticism about the fact that European countries and the UK haven't kind of really started to focus on that adaptation conversation. So I think this is a space we will see growing.
Yeah, to excuse the pun. Yeah, but it's interesting because for quite some time there's been loads of conversation around that whole low carbon piece, and it's probably only recently I've really heard a lot about the importance of being a better adapted city, about those greener spaces, the impact of the actual environment in terms of sort of water runoff, less concrete. Again, all obvious when you think about it, but it's not something that's really featured that highly in the conversation. It's all been about, using less electricity, reducing carbon footprints, understanding what that looks like in a bid to try and avoid climate change. The reality is it's upon us, isn't it? And actually this is talking about how we deal with it and try and recover from it a little bit.
Absolutely. And you're right, the focus, quite rightly, has been on decarbonisation. We need to across the world, we need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are being put into the atmosphere. But I think we've increasingly realised that, as you say, we've got the other job to do as well, which is to adapt. And I think we are starting to see that focus. I think things like the heat waves, or recent heat waves, I think it was 2022, and really started to kind of shine a light on the fact that we needed to do things differently. And for me, one of the most powerful things since sort of coming into this post, in terms of kind of crystallizing the fact that climate change is upon us, has been the conversations that I've had with teachers, pupils, people working in care homes, who are talking particularly about the heat, but also about the disruption caused by flooding.
Yeah, yeah. So we probably didn't find out much about you at the start of the podcast, but so you've got a connection going back to your childhood with the city through the Royal Navy.
That's right. My dad was in the Royal Navy, so
Yeah.
I variously lived in Portsmouth
Yeah.
until I was about 14.
Yeah.
And my dad's dad was in the Navy,
Right.
so he lived
Yeah.
in Portsmouth.
So a long history of family connection with the city. So sort of considering that, how do you think the environment's changed over time, sort of from when you were in the city as a child to now? And do you think it's for the better?
So yes, I would say definitely lots of things have changed for the better. And I'm not going to reveal my age on air, David, but I'm just
carefully sidestepping any.
But do you know what? I think I recall. So we lived just outside Portsmouth. I lived in Pembroke, but came into Portsmouth a lot. My mum taught in Portsmouth, a lot of the Portsmouth schools, and I recall being up on Portsdown Hill all the time as a child, and that's why I fell in love with nature. Just being on the hill, seeing the butterflies, seeing the flowers, seeing the view of Portsmouth. But I've had this conversation with my parents, who come back to Portsmouth quite a lot. They've got a lot of friends in Portsmouth, and think that my dad recalls Portsmouth from his childhood. I think he recalls coal-fired power stations.
Wow.
I don't know if that's correct, but he thinks it's a thriving city. And I think, as I said at the top of this call, just walking here today from the Civic, seeing the number of trees that have been planted, seeing so many wildflowers in our verges, and we're right in the city centre here. There's a lot going on, and work of people like the tree wardens in Portsmouth. I passed a couple of their community orchards. I think there's a thriving environment. There's a lot of green just in the building we're in. You kind of sit down and you're surrounded by bits of green, even though it's situated right on a busy roundabout.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting you mentioned sort of coal-powered stuff, because as a child, actually, one of the things, and I until you mentioned it, I kind of completely forgotten about it for decades. Our whole house was coal-powered. We used to have the coal man come round on the truck, delivering bags of coal, which we kept in the shed in the garden, and you had to go out and get the coal to stoke the fire, to get hot water. And we've moved on a long way since then, but there's just still so much more to be done.
That's right. And I think it's really important to recognise how things have moved on, and I guess things will always evolve. And going back to your point about sort of green environment groups, and we had that little bit of a conversation, didn't we, about sort of potentially those tensions between the environment and progress or whatever. It's about evolution, isn't it? And working out what's best at a moment in time, what the right thing to do is at a moment
There's
in
a really
time.
conflicted debate, isn't there, around the impact of aspirations to be carbon neutral on the economy versus the impact of not doing it. It's really problematic, but clearly needs to be done. But moving away from the low carbon and into the sort of the green spaces. So focusing on Portsmouth as a well-adapted city and what we need to do to get there, what would be your key calls to action, to people listening to this podcast? What are the, if there were a top 3 things that you would want a person or a business to do, what would they be?
Gosh, that's a tough question. I'm answering for myself.
Yeah.
So top 3 things. I think first of all, acknowledge that the climate is changing. I think until we kind of sort of acknowledge that, it's actually hard to have a platform to do anything off. So that would be one. Secondly, an individual or a business consider, so once we've acknowledged that things are changing, consider how that may affect you and the choices you make. For example, even crumbs, we're not going to go and play football in the park on a Saturday at 2:00 because it's baking hot. We'll wait. Just consider that the choices you make, and think about how you can develop your personal resilience. So, and then thirdly, think about others. Probably we talked about the fact that some people in our community will be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than others.
And we talk about that a lot in the winter, don't we? But we perhaps don't think about it in the same way in the summer. And like if you've got elderly neighbours in the winter, keep an eye on them, etc. But actually, it can be heat can be just as big a problem.
Absolutely. And I think it's those little strategies that we can adopt, and that we see in Mediterranean nations. People keep the sun out of their houses during the day. People always have kind of water with them. People have a slower pace of life during the day. Those kinds of little changes, but definitely think about others. And I would imagine that as we move forward, you've mentioned the winter, we talk about keeping an eye on your neighbour, we have warm spaces that people can go to. I would imagine what we'll start to see across the UK is this idea of cool spaces that people can go to, and increasing awareness that we go and check on our vulnerable neighbours in sort of periods of hardship.
Brilliant. And of course, we've mentioned that resource, Adaptation Scotland, so we'll kind of link that so people can access that. But a key part of that is that acknowledgement bit that you mentioned, is kind of doing a bit of research and finding out a bit more on what you can do.
And I think a lot of these adaptations I think there are infrastructure adaptations, but a lot of the adaptations are kind of behavioural. And I guess the sooner we start thinking about it, the easier that transition will be.
Absolutely. Something I have no doubt that we'll be talking about a lot more. You're now quite linked in with us and us with you in terms of how we're trying to support the business community around this. And we've spoken about that Southern Water piece and the relationship between the storm runoff, which people see a lot of activity around in the next 12 months, no doubt, with what's being planned there. So hopefully we'll see some big changes around the city and things going on. But we always like to finish our podcasts by talking about something locally, somewhere to go, something to do. What would be your recommendation for the city?
I've got so many. Portsmouth's a fantastic place in terms of its diversity of natural spaces. I talked about Portsdown Hill, lots of childhood memories for me, and over the next few months that is going to be full of different orchids and wildflowers. So an absolutely wonderful place to actually just go and sit, be quiet, listen to those insects. Do you know, last summer I was down on Eastney Beach, and if people haven't sort of been down there and noticed the colours of the plants, it's absolutely atmospheric. If it's hot, Fox's Forest is fantastic as a cool space, isn't it? And I think we're so lucky in Portsmouth to have an amazing team of countryside rangers that look after these sites. And of course, being Portsmouth, things are quite close. We don't have to travel far.
I think Fox's Forest might have come up once previously in the podcast, but we really easily forget about the sort of northern coastline and focus on South Sea and the seafront there. But actually, it is wonderful up there, and obviously there's a bit of work going on at the moment, but that will make that space even better up there still once all of that's completed. So yeah, lovely up at Fox's Forest, and obviously the cooling effect of walking through the woods there and the trees. Great dog walk round the loop there.
And it's quiet.
It is quite, yeah. So no, some great recommendations there. I'm going to be now paying attention to orchids on Portsdown Hill. I've not thought about orchids before, but I have to have a look out for those.
There are carpets of them,
Right.
pyramidal orchids.
Okay.
Richard, the countryside ranger up there's done an absolutely amazing job. Also, you find bee orchids as well, which are one of my favourites.
Yeah, I'd like to support bees.
Yeah, we need our pollinators.
Definitely. Well, brilliant. Great talking to you, Felicity. Thank you for coming in. Loads of information there. I think we previously mentioned about doing some sort of business related event later in the year, which we will probably still look to try and get up and running with you, just to try and do a bit more work around this. But lots going on already, and at Shaping we're really pleased to be linked in and supporting you with that work. So thanks for talking to us about it, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
You're welcome. This podcast was brought to you by Shaping Portsmouth, working to make Portsmouth the #1 UK city in which to invest, live, learn, work and visit. To find out more, please visit shapingportsmouth.co.uk. This podcast was supported by Spark Community Space and Portsmouth Community Lottery.